All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone doing tonight? My name is Ryan Vijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and welcome to our 65th anniversary presentation of the 7th Voyage of Sinbad, one of the greatest fantasy adventure films ever made. Has anybody seen this movie before? Okay, wow, all right, well, great. Well, if it's your first time, I don't think anything beats seeing it on a beautiful big screen like this. 7th Voyage of Sinbad is iconic thanks to the revolutionary special effects, stop motion animation work by the film's producer and special effects artist, Harryhausen. And I'm very honored to introduce, he's an author, film historian, and he had the pleasure of knowing Harryhausen personally for over 40 years. Please give a very warm round of applause to Mr. Sam Calvin. All right, how are you doing tonight, Sam?
Well, I want to apologize for not standing up. I'm 72 years young, and it's not as easy for me to stand up as it used to be. But is that my son who just walked in? All right, good. He'll help me around.
At least they can do a show off, right?
Thank you.
All right, wow, this is beautiful. So, back in the day, Mr. Calvin here was responsible for co-creating the first Harryhausen fanzine, or fan magazine. This is FXRH. This is a collection of the issues that he put out where he interviews Ray and he digs deep into the behind-the-scenes aspects of how these films were made.
If I may, let me mention, everybody says, what the heck is this title? What is this supposed to mean? And the FX is a common abbreviation in the industry for effects, special effects. And the RH, well, I'll let you guess what that stands for. So this is a magazine that I published from 1971 to 1974. There were 4 issues, and the 4 issues are pictured here on the cover of this, and this book reproduces all 4 of the issues. And it's pretty astonishing to me. There's something I'd completely forgotten about until I thumbed through this book again before I came over here. And that is how, for example, if you wanted to buy all 4 issues, it would cost about $760. So fork it over, okay? No, only kidding.
Do you have any of the original issues?
Oh yes, I have all the original issues, but I'm down to only a few copies, and I'm not going to part with them unless I'm threatened with serious artillery.
Well, if you ever want to see your son again.
By the way, there's a picture in here of, I don't know how quickly I can find it, but there it is in the back. Folks, sorry, you're out of luck, you're not seeing it, but it's a picture of my son, Paul, and my daughter, Rachel, and then Ray and Diana, his wife. And here they are sitting in my house. So they came to Fort Worth and visited, and some of you may know this already. There was a convention called the Dallas Fantasy Fair, and the convention had Ray as a guest for 4 years in a row, from 1991 to 1994. I see some heads shaking. Was anybody there at that convention? And that was a terrific opportunity for people to meet Ray. And I enjoyed interviewing him on stage. And anyway, I'll turn it back over, Ryan. I'm sure we're going to have questions at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, after the show, we're going to open up to a Q&A for the audience. Well, my first question is, there's a lot of young people who were not around when Ray Harryhausen was doing some of his best work. How would you pitch Ray Harryhausen to a contemporary audience? Why was he so important?
Well, I think a good friend of mine said it very well. He said, Ray Harryhausen made you believe in the fantasy. And I think that's absolutely true. He brought his own personal love for his creatures to the screen, and people picked up on that these were just not cartoons, that the movies themselves were serious. I mean, of course, they were fanciful, but they didn't lampoon the creatures or make light of them. Ray really did dislike that. As a matter of fact, I can remember being kind of upset one time when I found out that Ray did not love the movie Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is one of my favorites. And I said, Ray, how can you not love that movie? He said, well, because I felt that they were making fun of the monsters. And I worked so hard to make my creatures believable and somewhat ominous, not downright scary, but have a certain grandeur to them. I don't like to see that undercut, and I can understand that. I still said, you're wrong. Anyway.
One of the few times he was wrong.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, so 7th Voyage of Sinbad is an interesting, to me it's a significant turning point in Harryhausen's career, since up to that point, he was more famous for doing science fiction films like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Of course, he got his start on the wonderful Mighty Joe Young, working with his mentor, Willis O'Brien, who did the stop-motion animation on the original King Kong. But Sinbad represented a shift in his career. Why was that?
Well, Ray put it very simply one time. He said, I got tired of destroying things. And all of my early movies are about destruction. I mean, in The Beast from 20,000 Fathom, it's New York City that comes in for it. And it came from Beneath the Sea at San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. Earth versus the Flying Saucers, it's Washington, D.C. 20 million miles to Earth, it's Rome. As a matter of fact, some of you may know that the main impetus for making 20 million miles to Earth was that Ray wanted to take a vacation overseas. He wanted to go to Rome. So he pulled out his sketches for 20 million miles to Earth, which he'd made many years before and couldn't get people interested in. And Charles Schneer, his longtime producer, said that's going to be our next picture. So I think one of the great partnerships was Charles Schneer and Ray Harryhausen. And I think thanks to Charles Schneer's utter willingness to sink money into the production of his films, Ray had a career that somebody who, like Willis O'Brien, unfortunately did not have.
Right. Well, Harryhausen was certainly influential over the decades. He had a large following. And so this is actually our third installment in our series, Wishes and Wonders, the Arabian Nights on Film, where each week we've been showing a classic film based on the 1001 Nights, the famous collection of stories of Middle Eastern folklore. And there have been several, I mean, maybe dozens of Sinbad movies or stories or films inspired by the adventures of Sinbad the Sailor up to this point. Notably, in 1947, you had Sinbad the Sailor with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. In 1955, only 3 years before this movie was made, you had The Son of Sinbad starring Dale Robertson and Vincent Price, which is a lot of fun. And these movies are all entertaining in their own way. But what do you think sets 7th Voyage of Sinbad apart from these other adaptations?
Well, Ray said to me one time, he said in these other movies, they would talk about the creatures. But I wanted to see the Cyclops. I wanted to see the Rock. And I figured that I was the person to do it, to bring it to the screen. And that he was.
Oh, absolutely. So please, I hope you guys enjoy the film. Please stick around after the movie for our post-show discussion, where we will open it up to the audience if you guys have any questions for Mr. Calvin. Oh, yes.
I want to make one more comment just for something that you might want to look for. Ray mentioned to me the very first time that I met him in 1971, I visited his home. He said, I went to an awful lot of trouble to put a shadow on the ground for the Cyclops. So take a look in those early scenes when the Cyclops appears, and you'll see how Ray added a shadow to the Cyclops.
Yeah, that's something that always blew me away too, because it's something we take for granted, right? But the shadow adds a whole another layer of realism to the film. So guys, please keep your eyes open for the Cyclops shadow. Yes?
Is this also done with dynamation?
Yes, well, can you just explain the dynamation process real quick?
Yes, the dynamation process in a nutshell is a combination of two special effects processes, rear projection and split screen. Rear projection means, as many of you probably know, that the live action part of what you're seeing is projected onto a screen from behind the model. The split screen is to allow the model to appear to be walking on the ground and not just underneath. His feet just don't disappear at the bottom of the frame in order to, he does what they call a matte shot, a split screen, so that the creature can walk around and not just, you see the entire creature.
Awesome, well thank you so much, and we will see you after the show.
All right, thank you, Ryan.
All right, please give a round of applause for Mr. Tyler. All right, so what did everybody think of the film? Well, it certainly makes a difference watching it on a big screen like that, doesn't it?
Oh, it sure does. I was about to say that to you. Now you stole my line.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of movie with its spectacle and the color and everything, it's great to see it on a big screen. It's been ages since I've seen it on a big screen.
Well, I was going to ask you, what is your earliest memory of the film? When did you see it for the first time?
Oh, I saw it when it originally came out, and I was younger. And the movie came out in December of 1958. I was born in 1951. Somebody, maybe you could help me with the math there. Anyway, I was a youngster, and I remember being blown away by watching it and wondering after it was all over, nobody's ever thought this before, how did they do that? Are they giant machines? And there was actually a comic book, a Marvel comic book, that had a story about a movie being made, and that's what they were. The giant monsters were big machines. And I don't know, even at my young age, I was somewhat skeptical, but I did not have a clue as to how this was done.
And I'm sure this
sparked your lifelong fascination with Ray Harryhausen's work. How did you begin that correspondence with him?
It was entirely due to the magazine that I and my good friend Ernie Farino put together, starting in the early 70s. And the first issue was in 1971, and I was in Europe at that time. Not when the magazine came out, but shortly thereafter as part of a program at my college. And I can remember swallowing hard and picking up the phone and calling Ray's number and saying, I sure hope you got the magazine. And he said, I just finished reading it. So that was perfect timing. That really worked out great, and he was very quick to invite me to his lovely home, and that's how it all started.
Oh, well, now you mentioned earlier that when he did 20 million miles to Earth, it was basically an excuse to get a vacation to go to Rome. Right? So, as you can see, 7th Voyage of Sinbad was shot in beautiful Spain.
Right.
And I imagine that was another one of his ideas. It's like, why not shoot a beautiful
absolutely.
tropical location? Yeah.
Well, also, his producer, Charles Schneer, wanted to take advantage of exotic locations.
Right.
Having made a series of films earlier which involved basically destruction of cities, he wanted to go in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say Spain was the perfect choice because not only do you have the kind of the very unique rock formations, the tropical beaches, but they actually got permission to shoot at the Alhambra, which because of the Moorish Arab invasion of Spain, there was the Islamic conquest. You had a lot of beautiful Moorish architecture. So everything, every time when we're in Baghdad, when we see the palace, the walls, the arches, that was all shot on location at the real Alhambra Palace.
Yes, and some of the later movies following 7th Voyage, Three Worlds of Gulliver, Mysterious Island, were filmed there as well. Now, for Jason and the Argonauts, they went to a different locale.
Yeah, well, speaking of Three Worlds of Gulliver, one of the stronger aspects of it, I mean, it's a great movie all around, but I think what really sells it is Kerwin Matthews' performance as Sinbad. As mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of great actors to play this role, but I think he plays it with a certain swashbuckling authority. He's a very dashing figure, and you can tell he takes the material seriously, and I think he does everything he can as an actor to convince the audience that he is actually interacting with these creatures.
Exactly right. That was what I was going to suggest, but you've done so. He said that Ray was very appreciative of the fact that Kerwin Matthews brought a very earnest demeanor to the film, no winking at the camera. And he said, he just had a great gift for giving the impression that he was really seeing these things, especially in the skeleton fight.
What was it like? I mean, obviously you weren't there at the time, but did Ray ever discuss all the detail that went into choreographing that skeleton fight? Because I imagine it's a comprehensive dance number because there's nothing there. You literally have to hit every single mark. And not only in this film, but if you ever get a chance, watch Jason and the Argonauts, where you have, 12 skeletons? How many?
No, there were 7.
Oh, 7 skeletons. In my mind, it multiplies the
The
skeleton.
Hydra
Yeah.
had 7 heads, 1 skeleton per Hydra head.
That's right, yeah, because they all came from, was it the teeth of the Hydra?
That's right.
Yeah.
Children of the Hydra's teeth.
The children of the Hydra's teeth, yeah. So how was Ray able to choreograph these complex fight scenes?
Well, he had a very interesting way of doing that. First of all, he would photograph on black and white film, for example, the character or characters in Jason and the Argonauts fighting nothing. And he would rehearse it and choreograph it so that, for example, Kerwin Matthews would do the same moves with nothing. And the actors who played the Argonauts, same kind of thing, only of course more complicated because they're fighting 7 opponents. So they would do it, practice it over and over and over again, and it was like a dance. And the stunt person who assisted, Enzo Musumeci Greco, that's a hard thing to say, he worked on both Sinbad and Jason, and that was just basically the way they did it. They planned it like a dance.
Yeah, and another interesting thing about Jason and the Argonauts, they had very similar set pieces. Obviously, Jason and the Argonauts is based on Greek mythology. Did Ray ever confide in you that, was Jason and the Argonauts sort of an excuse to do a Sinbad re-over? Was he able to incorporate ideas in that maybe he couldn't tackle in 7th Voyage of Sinbad?
Well, one of the things that generally improved over time was the technique that Ray used, especially with respect to the quality of the image, the rear screen image. I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier. Basically, the techniques are rear screen and split screen. So whenever you're seeing a monster and a live actor or actors, the live action is actually being projected on a screen behind the figure. And then he mats out the bottom of the picture so that he can make the creature or creatures walk around. That's fairly complicated to do, to say the least, but I think it works extremely well. And over time, the film stock improved. And so the picture became more sharp, and that was a big help. So that's something you see quite a bit. Now, in one of his later films, First Men in the Moon, because that movie was a widescreen movie, that's the only widescreen movie that Ray ever did, he had to resort to a completely different technique of traveling mats to do that.
Yeah, and all those films are wonderful. But what prompted Ray's, let me go back a little bit. So obviously, 7th Voyage of Sinbad was inspired by the adventures of Sinbad the Sailor from the 1001 Nights. But what's kind of fascinating is even though in popular culture we have this image of Sinbad as he's a swashbuckling captain, he's a heroic figure, not unlike Robin Hood or Zorro, right? He's the star of all these major adventure films. In the original stories, he's not the captain at all. He's a regular merchant who happens to find himself in these exceedingly more bizarre situations, and he kind of gets a taste of the adventure and says, okay, yeah, I'll go out on another voyage, and through the fate of God, the will of God, the will of the universe, he finds himself coming across the giant Cyclops, or the Rock, or cannibals, or whatever. And this was a lot of fodder for Ray because of this film, he ended up doing 2 more sequels. I don't know if you can call them sequels necessarily, but there is a trilogy of Sinbad adventures. This was followed up in 1974 with The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, starring John Philip Law, and he closed out the trilogy in 1977 with Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. We actually showed this here last May with our special guest Patrick Wayne, who played Sinbad in that film. Was anyone here for that when we did Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger? All right, yeah. Well, thank you. I see my regulars, my friends. You came out and supported Patrick Wayne, and I appreciate that. But no, it was a lot of fun having him here in person. And what do you think it was about the cycle of Sinbad stories that kept Ray wanting to return to that world?
Well, to be blunt, it was the financial failure of the movie that he made prior to Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and that was The Valley of Guanji.
Oh, that's a fun
The Valley
one.
of Guanji really took it out of Ray because it has more animation cuts than any of his other films. It has over 300 animation cuts. And the movie did not do well.
Oh, wow.
And frankly, certainly it wasn't the fault of the film, in my judgment. I think it's a delightful movie and Ray's work is spectacular. It's just that there was a change of hands at Warner Brothers, which released the movie, and the new regime that just came in, they didn't want to have anything to do with work that preceded their arrival. I know that's hard to believe that business people would be like that, but that's what happened. And so they just dumped it on the market, and which is a real shame considering how much work Ray put into it. But it's really gained a lot of stature over the years because Ray just did a fantastic amount of animation in that.
In Valley of Guanji, if you've never seen it, if you've never heard of it, it's a lot of fun because it's literally cowboys in the Old West fighting dinosaurs. You can't go wrong with that, which apparently they did when it was released, unfortunately. But it's a lot of fun if you can check it out on TCM or pick it up on Blu-ray. It's a very entertaining film.
The scene in Guanji where Guanji is lassoed by cowboys on horses was a fantastic piece of work, very complicated to do because Ray had to put Guanji in the middle of the action and cowboys on either side. And that involved a lot of camera trickery that I won't go into, but it took quite a bit of time to work that out. Again, so many things in Ray's films are choreographed, and that was particularly complicated.
Okay, if it's all right with you, can we open it up to the audience if they have any questions? All right, does anyone have any questions?
Everybody except this guy in the.
He looks
That's
like
my son. There you go. So.
Yes, it can be about Sinbad, it can be about Ray Harryhausen in general. Yes, sir. Yes.
Well, give us a little bit of your bio. Where were you raised? How did you get in? What brought you into the whole area? You're only 2 years older than I am, and I'm remembering movies that I saw in the 70s, for instance, and late 60s. Every Saturday I was at my theater looking at something.
Right, I'm a local too. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Arlington Theater. I practically grew up in the Arlington Theater. Every Saturday they had a kids show. Well, a whole bunch of folks turned out to that on a regular basis, and I was one of them. That's where I saw many of Ray's films for the first time. And what's kind of funny is, for a while there, I thought Ray ground out a movie every week because I saw 7th VOYAGE there originally. I saw 20 Million Miles to Earth there, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, a lot of the earlier films. And they just showed them, without much of a separation in terms of time. So I just thought, boy, this guy can really put these things out there. Of course, I was dead wrong about that.
Were these targeted kind of for kid and youth audiences? I mean, they were fantasies, obviously, but told good stories.
I would say yes, that they were targeted to young people. Ray really did want to make movies that would appeal to young people. I would say that that's true. And one of the things that kind of rankled him was how sometimes critics would say the movies are childish. An example of that would be in 7th VOYAGE, somebody criticized how childish the movie was because a child played a genie. And I'm going, well, I wonder how parents would have liked it if Catherine Grant slides into the genie's lamp and there's a grown man there. I don't think that would have worked too well. So.
Well, I was going to say, this is not a very terribly helpful genie in this film. If it was Rex Syndrome or Robin Williams, you could just ask them, hey, hey, Carissa, she's small, can you bring her back to normal size? Or hey, how can we get off this island? The genie, okay, yeah, you get 3 wishes, boom. In this one, he just says, okay, well, you're on your own, go do this, go do this. He gives you some hints, right? But he doesn't necessarily save the day, like some of the other big screen genies. Do you have any other questions?
I'll keep going. I've got several thoughts.
Sure.
This was released through what studio? Columbia? Was this?
Right, it was a Columbia picture.
Are there different portions of the big corporations that would deal with this genre of movie making and so forth?
Well, because Ray and Charles Schneer hit it off so well. Charles Schneer was blown away by Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which was a Warner Brothers picture.
Okay.
And so he approached Ray and wound up, making many movies with Ray. And he had, he was married to somebody who was in cahoots with Columbia Pictures, so that makes a big difference. So worked out well.
Yeah, well, typically in that era, there were a lot of studios associated with certain genres. Like Warner Brothers in the early days, they were all about the gangster film, the domestic melodramas. You had Universal Studios, who was best known for their horror films, monster movies like Frankenstein and Dracula. And like even in the 50s and 60s, you had Hammer Films in England, who were famous for their horror and science fiction films. A lot of them were distributed by Columbia at that time. And actually, there's a wonderful Hammer film from the early 60s called Maniac. And it's a film noir, it's black and white, there's a lot of twists and turns, and it stars Kerwin Matthews, who plays Sinbad. So he was an American, but he went to the UK to film that. So yeah, if you get a chance to see Maniac, it's a lot of fun. I highly recommend that. All right, do you have any other questions? Anything? Yes, sir, you?
One of the things that I think is really impressive is how well everything matches up. You had talked about the choreography, and my question was, do you know what the shooting schedule was? Like how much time was spent on principal photography of the actors?
I didn't hear the last part. Do I know what?
The shooting schedule?
How long it took to shoot the actors versus how long it took to animate, just because everything matches up so well.
Well, again, it was very, very important for the live action to be choreographed. So all that was done, of course, in advance of any of the stop motion work, and the stop motion work was fitted in to whatever the live action they had. So they would edit the actor, Kerwin Matthews in this case, swinging his sword at thin air. But again, it would be rehearsed many, many times. One of the things that Kerwin Matthews kind of jokingly complained about was, let me tell you something, that sword is heavy. And in many scenes, I have to pretend that the sword is hitting the sword of the skeleton. And so I have to bring it to a complete stop and kind of let it do a bit of a rebound to look realistic. And he was extremely sore. When I say sore, I don't mean miffed. I mean just physically exhausted after the various shots there that Ray then took. And what Ray does is he takes, they take a black and white print of the footage of Sinbad or the Argonauts fighting nothing, and he has a moviola machine that goes, can go through any and all frames at any and all speeds, including one frame at a time. And so he looks at that moviola and goes through it and then matches that with the color animated figures.
Did you ever get to talk to Kerwin Matthews?
No.
Oh, you never met him?
No, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, he passed away before I was ever able to connect with him.
Yeah, well, you had to settle for Ray. What can you do? What can you say? That's a wonderful. You had a question, right?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how did Ray feel about technology as far as progressing? I know Clash was his last film in '81, but how did he feel as far as just the technology evolving?
Well, that's a good question, because I think Ray had mixed feelings about it and didn't want to come across as being hostile in any way to the new technology. And he was absolutely blown away by Jurassic Park. Steven Spielberg, that movie came out in 1993, and Steven Spielberg invited Ray to see footage before it came out, and Ray was just blown away by it. And then also Phil Tippett.
Yeah.
Phil Tippett was kind of the successor to Ray Harryhausen with respect to stop motion, and he famously said, well, I think I'm extinct, when he saw footage from Jurassic Park, which it is an absolutely amazing film in terms of the quality and novelty of the effects. At that time, 1993, for them to do that was astounding. Of course, also kind of interestingly, there was a full-sized T-Rex that was built for the movie, and by Stan Winston, and then the animation was done by Dennis Murin and the crew that was to become Industrial Light and Magic. And so those two techniques wound up blending quite well.
Well, you mentioned Phil Tippett, Steven Spielberg, guys like George Lucas, Sam Raimi, they've been on record emphasizing how much of an influence Ray's work was. Do you know in those later years, was Ray ever personally approached? Maybe, like, why not, like you said, Steven Spielberg offered to show him a rough cut. Why not invite Ray early on? Why not be a consultant or let him in on the process? Was Ray ever invited, or was he more interested in developing his own projects?
Well, The Empire Strikes Back, you may remember, has quite a bit of stop motion animation in it with the walkers.
What movie is that?
The AT-ATs, the Empire Strikes Back.
Empire Strikes Back. Has
The
anyone seen it?
walkers, the all-terrain armored.
The AT-ATs, yeah, the Hoth planet.
Right. And Ray was approached to do that film.
I had never heard that. All right, this is breaking news.
George Lucas met with Ray, but Ray was he just wasn't up to the task. He didn't consider himself up to the task of animating that many figures. But it's kind of funny. Ray said, "There's no way I'm going to pass up the chance to not shake the hand of the man who made $500 million," meaning with Star Wars. So I thought that was pretty funny.
Wow.
Oh, that's incredible. I had never heard that story. Yes.
Sorry. Sticking with the Star Wars theme, will you share the story? You know, you've had a lot of well-known people in Hollywood approach you over the years to show their appreciation because they were fans of the magazine. Can you tell the folks the story about a letter?
I know who you're going to say.
Yeah.
Again, my magazine came out in the early 1970s, and we got a letter after, there were 4 issues, we got a letter after issue 3 from somebody who said, "I would really appreciate it if you go into more detail about specifically how certain effects are achieved. I have read all the magazines up to this point, and I still don't know what a matte shot is." Signed, Mark Hamill. Well, he kind of learned what a matte shot was. I don't know if any of you saw that delightful documentary on the making of Star Wars that he did, and he goes into a lot of explanations in that one. So he came on board. I'll say that much. He became well educated.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Mark Hamill, if you watch him in interviews, he seems like he's just as much of a fanboy as any of us. He grew up watching these fantasy films. So, Mr. Calvin, thank you so much for being here. Do you have any closing thoughts? Sorry, you have one more question. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I'm actually watching, but I'm also an animator. So I was actually had the pleasure to meet Harryhausen in his 90s, just a few, like 6 months before he died, because he came over to Dallas to do a presentation, and I was among the audience and got his autograph. So, but one of the things I found as I was watching this
I'm hoping, can you repeat what you,
Well, she
I'm
was
sorry,
asking-
my ears are not what they used to be, so.
Well, she has a background as an animator, and she read that when he was doing the dynamation process, Harryhausen invented a method of, during the stop motion, adding a motion blur to certain frames to give it that sense of realism, right? But when you're watching this version, since stop motion animation is done frame by frame by frame, it looks very crisp and clear. And I believe the question was, she was wanting to know when Ray developed that process of adding the motion blur. Is that right? Does that
Yeah,
sound?
it's
Yeah.
like how did he come up with that idea? So,
Well, I'm gonna be a little bit obstinate here. I don't think Ray really cared that much with respect to the blur. I think his attitude, he's on record for saying, "Would it sell another ticket?" That was a famous line of his. And I think it really took kind of the generation of the folks from Industrial Light and Magic, especially the movie Dragon Slayer. Dragon Slayer was a key movie with respect to introducing blurs on the creatures. And the way it was done in Dragon Slayer was kind of a special case, because in Dragon Slayer, when the dragon walks through the cave, you don't see the dragon's feet. And that was the key to the operation there, because the feet of the dragon were attached to a motorized device that, just as you indicated, the device moved for each frame. So that introduced a motion blur that added very, very effectively to the realism. I still think Dragon Slayer is an absolutely amazing film, especially when it came out very early on. When CGI came, of course, with CGI, you can kind of do anything with CGI. Not that I don't mean to be putting it down at all, but prior to CGI, I just thought Dragon Slayer was a wonderful advance in the technology of making things look more real.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts on 7th Voyage of Sinbad?
None whatsoever. No, I will say that I think that Seventh Voyage is my favorite Ray Harryhausen movie. I think that it captures an aura of fantasy that is absolutely charming. And I love Jason and the Argonauts also. I mean, Ray would say, Jason has better effects. But his two favorite movies that he made were Jason and 7th Voyage. And he said there's some technical work in 7th Voyage that if I had it to do all over again, I would have wished that we'd had a higher budget. But we didn't, and I did what I could. And I think he was very proud of both of those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Calvin, for joining us tonight. If people want to read more of your work or check it out, where can they find it?
I don't know where they could find it, I guess. In the, son, do you have the book that I have?
It's right next to
Oh.
Yeah.
Kind of missed it. There's this book that I put together of all of the issues of the magazine. And it's kind of hard to come by. So I would recommend that you check on eBay, that kind of place, to see if you can find one. And it's gonna have, it actually has better reproduction than the original magazines because the paper is glossy paper. And they keep popping up on occasion. And I'll tell you right now, what you might want to do is follow this guy around, because I'm going to give him this book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Awesome.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Calvin, for your time. And
Sure, yeah.
One more thing. If I see that book on eBay tomorrow, I'm going to have a few things to say to you.
okay, well, yeah, you won't have to worry about that. I can assure you. May we please get a round of applause to Mr. Sam Calvin.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a good night, and hopefully we'll see you next Monday for Thief of Baghdad. Thanks again.